So I've been asked to talk about conducting freedom to operate assessments in relation to ADCs, but the first point I want to make is a general one, in that any freedom to operate is only going to be effective, both productive and cost effective, if you're specific about what you're trying to achieve. I had a client come to me a few years ago, and they had looked to do some freedom to operate searching. They had spent £250,000, but they'd done it with very open objectives. They ended up with a document that thick, which was no more use than a doorstop, because they hadn't asked the right questions. If you don't ask the right questions, you won't get the right answers. So you need to know what your objectives are. The key thing, really, is knowing what your technology is. If you can't define the technology, you can't do adequate searching against it and an adequate assessment against it. So what aspects does your technology possess? What are you really interested in finding out about? You also might want to limit it in other ways. Territories, I mean, it's not effective to search against the whole world. So think about what commercial territories are important to you, what will give you a fair assessment which you can proceed on. Not generally appropriate for full freedom to operate, but as an initial quick and cheap way of finding out what some of the risks are, you may just want to search against your competitors, and that can be one way of getting some quick and dirty results. Skip through those. There's various different approaches in different industries. Unsurprisingly, given the costs involved, the high value, and the very crowded field in relation to ADCs, I think I'm probably preaching to the converted when I say some freedom to operate assessments are going to be appropriate here. For a variety of reasons, ones I suggested, and the fact that it's difficult to design around a later date. Certainly very expensive to do so. In relation to ADCs, relative to some other areas, such as small molecule pharmaceuticals, one change is you will generally be using and exposed to a wider range of technologies than you might be in a traditional small molecule product. That means there's potentially different areas of IP, and you may need to look at doing a greater number of freedom to operate assessments. One area to think about, possibly first up, is the antigen. What are you looking at? Most countries around the world will allow very broad antibody-based claims in relation to antigens. So if you discover a novel antigen, most countries will let you have a claim to any antibody which binds to that antigen. So you can, just by selecting an antigen, you can walk into some very broad patent protection which you might want to consider. Range of issues in relation to antibodies. I'll put a number of technologies up there. As we heard this morning, although a lot of these technologies are now quite old, there are still some patents in force in relation to them. And so depending on what your antibody you're using, there are various things you may want to bear in mind. In addition, a lot of antibody claims are defined, at least in part, in relation to their epitope. That's because antibody claims can be difficult to get granted, and the patent offices will often allow them if they specify the epitope. So you may, if you run into epitope claims, you may have the question of, well, how well characterized is your own epitope? To what extent can you assess whether or not you have freedom to operate? In addition, how is the antibody selected? That was a case from earlier last year now, in relation to phage display. All sorts of ways of optimizing the antibodies. And again, these can all give rise to novel and inventive technologies, and therefore third-party intellectual property, which you may risk running into. And that's just the antibody, which, as we've just heard, is not even the most important part of the product for an ADC. You've got the drugs, you've got the methods of conjugation, so you've got a question about what linkers are you using, what technologies are you using to conjugate the payload to the antibody. Again, very crowded area, lots of third-party IP, and the payload itself. You may have proprietary payloads, even if you were looking to use a very well-established off-patent payload. As John said, it's a black art. You find some payloads have certain advantages when used in an ADC. So there may be IP protection specifically around that payload as part of an ADC product. So there's a number of areas you might want to look at. I'm not saying that you necessarily need to run off and conduct freedom to operate assessments in relation to all of these. There's a risk assessment. For example, if you're using a proprietary payload, you might be perfectly happy to rely on the supplier's freedom to operate. You may take a view that some of these, the risk isn't great enough to justify the budget, you can spend your money elsewhere, but these are things you may want to be thinking about. Now, clearly, when you're developing your product, day one, you're not going to know all of those different aspects you may want to look at, so you'll be looking at an incremental approach. Start off, you may want to do some freedom to operate around the target you're going to be looking at. And then as you develop your product, different technologies get applied, and then you may want to look at freedom to operate in relation to those technologies. So you have this incremental approach. In addition, as you go on, you may want to consider top-up searches. So that's where, further down the line, period of 1 year, 18 months, whatever it is, you conduct the same freedom to operate analysis again in relation to the gap between the last time you did it and now. A few reasons for doing that. First of all, as some of you will know, patents are only generally published 18 months after they're filed. So any freedom to operate analysis you do will always have an 18-month time lag. You're always 18 months behind what's actually happening. And in addition, third parties will keep filing patents. There may be new prior art file which is going to be relevant to what you're doing. In addition to risk assessment, this can also be useful for competitor intelligence. So there may be additional benefits. It goes without saying, if you are taking this incremental approach, your IP manager needs to know what's actually happening in the lab. So communication is essential. It's essential for a number of reasons, including protecting your own position as well as assessing risk in relation to other parties. With any freedom to operate analysis, there are inherent limitations. No assessment is ever going to be perfect. The first one is one I mentioned, the 18-month delay. The second one is also going to be language limitations. Whoever you're getting to conduct your analysis, they will have a limited number of languages they can work in. Now, you can mitigate that by instructing different people to cover different territories, but ultimately you're not going to cover the whole world. Even where some documents have abstracts in, say, English, or you can use machine translations, they're generally imperfect, and you have to bear in mind that you may well miss documents in foreign languages which you haven't looked at. Even allowing for that, even within the languages the individuals are working, no search will ever be perfect. If you conduct the same analysis twice, you will probably find a different subset of documents. The more money you're prepared to spend, the more different approaches you can take to doing the search, but there's always a risk you're going to miss something. So no search will ever be 100%. Now, even if you do your analysis and you find out that actually you look clear, that doesn't mean you're never going to be asserted against. Parties will still assert their rights, even if you think they don't have a leg to stand on. Sometimes even if they think they don't have a leg to stand on, they will have a go. So there's no guarantee that you won't end up in some sort of discussion. And if you were, unfortunately, to end up in some sort of court proceeding, there's always the risk of the unexpected decision. I've called it the 25% there. That's because litigators generally will never give you more than a 75% chance of victory, even when they think the case is at the strongest it could be. There's always a risk that the judge will come up with something different, switch the legal position, and you end up with a result you don't expect. So freedom to operate is important, but it's not by no means a guarantee. Now, the other thing is, freedom to operate is not the end of the story. When you get your results back, you hope that they will be completely clean, there'll be nothing to worry about, everything's tickety-boo. Hopefully, but probably not going to be the case, especially in a crowded area like this. Hopefully, it won't also be the case that the position is so bad that you run screaming from the field, never to return again. The reality is there's going to be some grey issues, some things you need to think about. Various strategies you can take for dealing with that, depending on the circumstances. I've listed some up on the board here. The first of those is adapt. It may be that actually the patent you're worried about covers a narrow technical area. It's very easy for you to technically design around. The costs of doing so aren't so great. So that may be something you can do. Challenge may be an option. You may think that the patent actually does cause you some problems, but that it's invalid. Or that to the extent it covers your technology, it's invalid. So you may want to challenge it either to revoke it in its entirety, or at least to limit its scope sufficiently so that it no longer affects you. I've put ignore up there, which does sometimes surprise people, but it can be a perfectly legitimate option. For example, you may take the view that it's invalid, but you don't need to go and tweak the tail of the tiger. You can wait and see if someone comes to you. It may be an area where it's on the fringes of your activity and you don't think they're going to, the other party are going to realize what you're up to or be worried about taking steps against you. I had a client a few years ago who had, having conducted some freedom to operate, had a number of patents which they thought were on the fringes of being relevant and probably invalid anyway. So all they did was they had a bookcase, lever arch files, each file a patent, a number of prior art documents. To date, only one of these patents has been raised by a third party. and all the client did was take the file out, take out the prior art, say, there you go away, you're invalid, I'm not interested. If it's well thought out and credible and sensible, ignoring it can be a perfectly valid strategy to follow. Monitoring. Often you'll find patent applications which will start out with very broad claims which could be relevant to you if they got granted in that form. But the reality is they will probably be narrowed as they go through prosecution. So you may just want to keep an eye on them, see how they develop. Hopefully they will be amended in such a way they're no longer relevant, and if they're not, then you can decide what to do then, possibly challenge if needs to. Acquire, obviously depends on your circumstances. It's not going to be feasible in all, for all people. Although I did have a very small client who, doing freedom to operate, found a third-party patent held by a company which was in administration. So they were able to buy the patent out of the company at a knockdown price. It turned out to be the most important patent in their portfolio because it was very early and covered their own activities and some competitors. So it's sometimes feasible. And licensing. I've put two specific examples up there. Cross-licensing. It's often thought of as something being more relevant to telecoms companies. But I am aware of some deals done by some of the bigger players in this area where they've cross-licensed their technology so they can just get on with their business. And I've also mentioned compulsory licensing. This doesn't often crop up, but I'm thinking here particularly in relation to those broad any antibody binding and antigen claims I mentioned earlier on. We had a case in the UK courts last year around such a claim. And the judge found that the claims to the patent were valid, but he implied that actually the Eli Lilly, the party against whom the patent was potentially going to be enforced, they developed their own product, which was completely separate from the product the patentee had developed, and that there would be a public interest in ensuring that that product could go to market and be used to treat patients. So the judge implied that actually, in this case, if HGS continued to push, then the judge may well enforce a compulsory license. Depending on how much you want to read into that case, there was also an implication that actually the license fee in that would be quite small because actually all the real work was done by Lilly and HGS just introduced the antigen to a bioinformatics process and didn't really contribute very much to the invention. That's possibly reading more into it than is there, but there is some implication to that. So I mean, the final point there, freedom to operate is unlikely to be the end of the process. One final point I'd like to make, which isn't on the slides, is what do you do with your freedom to operate report once you've got it in relation to third parties? It may well be that when you're licensing, when you're seeking investment, the other side wants to see your freedom to operate report. I would urge you to always resist that. The reason for doing that is that if you provide it to a third party, you, from the point of view of US law at least, are potentially destroying the confidentiality in that freedom to operate report. The flip side of that is if, God forbid, you ever end up in litigation in the US, that will be disclosable to the other side, which puts you at risk of willful infringement, triple damages, and there may be something damaging in there, such as saying we think there's a reasonable risk we infringe this patent. The way to get round that is possibly to have a summary letter provided to the other side and then get the lawyers in the room and just let them discuss any further issues. Generally, when I've come across this, most sort of VC, sophisticated investors understand this and it's not a problem. I've run into it once with a consumer company, and I would just advise you to dig your heels in and not put yourself in a riskier position. With that in mind, I think that's it.
Andrew, thank you very much.